Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Andrew Stuck. I'm one of the co-producers of Soundwalk September, of which this is an event within. We're, as you can imagine, getting to the end of the month, and we've got lots of different events going on. This is something special because this is Lydia's last Footloose event. She actually hands the baton over to a new poet in residence, whom we announced yesterday at the showcase for the writing competition. And the new poet in residence may choose to do something completely different. We shall see. His name is Tony Horrocks. He's from East Dorset. And Lydia's put her foot down. She said she's going to take the word footloose away with her. So whatever he gets up to, he's not going to be allowed to use footloose again. But that sort of brings me round to what I really want to say, which is a huge thank you to Lydia, because Lydia has introduced us to some fabulous poets, and she's also created a really good series of events, and we've really enjoyed them. So Lydia, a sort of round of applause from us for doing just that. That's really brilliant. And now, on that note, I'm going to introduce Lydia with how she wishes to be introduced. She sent me a note on how it is, so let me read it. Lydia Kennaway. Lydia's debut pamphlet, A History of Walking, was published by Happenstance in 2019. And in the same year, she earned an MA in writing poetry from Newcastle University. Her work has appeared in 10 anthologies and in many magazines. Lydia won the Flambard Poetry Prize in 2017 and was commended in the 2021 Magma Poetry Competition. Lydia, you're taking the reins.
Thank you so much. I can't believe we've got to the end of my residency. It's been an absolute blast. I've had so much fun doing this. Yeah, I think a lot of credit goes to Walk, Listen, Create for giving me free rein to just dream up what I wanted to do and then letting me do it. For those of you who have been to Footloose before and supported it, through all the events, I really thank you. And for those of you who are new to it, you can see the previous episodes on YouTube. They're all there. I always say it's kind of nice to see where people are tuning in from. I think we have Chicago, London, Portugal, where else? Yorkshire, Newcastle, Switzerland. We'll put it in the chat, and it'll be fun to see where people are listening in from. I can't remember. I don't think Andrew mentioned that we have links in the chat to the texts for tonight's poems. So if you want to read along, you can find that in the chat. I do always suggest that you just listen as we're reading them, and then perhaps as we discuss them, you might want to refer to the texts. Tonight, it is my enormous privilege to have Helen Mort as my final Footloose guest. The trouble with introducing Helen is deciding which of her many achievements to leave out of an introduction, because otherwise we'd be there half the night. So this is what I've come up with. Helen is an award-winning author based in Sheffield. Among her books are 3 poetry collections and the memoir, A Line Above the Sky, in which she muses on the challenges of both mountain climbing and motherhood. Helen's been shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize and Costa Prize and won the Fenton Aldborough Prize in 2015. She appears regularly on BBC Radio and is a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. Helen is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. So beat that. I've called this episode Hemmed In because Helen and I are both going to be reading poems about women walking and the clothes they wear when walking, and the significance imparted to these clothes, the restrictions they cause, and the conventions of women's attire in walking. I'm going to start by reading Advice to Women Walking After Dark. A lot of you have heard a lot of the poems from, since we're doing infomercials, from A History of Walking. And will already know that I enjoy taking on different voices in the poems that I write. I mean, this is a standard tool in the poet's toolbox. I have tried to voice the experiences of hikers, of an elderly woman who's fallen, and even of a dog. What is more difficult, I mean, this is usually an exercise in empathy. In this poem, I'm voicing an antagonist, and this is a slightly different tack, but also it has its poetic uses. Advice to women walking after dark. Think like your assailant. He's looking for someone who chooses to walk on the dark side of the street, who is alone, who dresses provocatively. Don't wear headphones, wear shoes you can run in. Don't be afraid to use your nails harboring blood or other trace material will help DNA analysis later. Thank you. Helen, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Lydia. And yeah, just to reiterate, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be a guest on Footloose and an honour to be part of the last one. And thank you, Andrew, as well. And it's lovely to hear that poem, which I've obviously been spending a lot of time with, read out loud in your voice. I am going to talk quite a lot about how it looks on the page as well in my sort of reading of it. So that kind of, but it's nice to hear it on the air. I keep thinking whenever I say that of Ocean Vuong's quote that for me the air is a second page, which I think is really beautiful, the idea that the air is a page too. So I guess if this sounds good to you, Lydia, I'm just going to have some reflections on your piece, which I really enjoyed. So my first thought when I was reading it was that this is a poem that makes me want to reclaim the night. It felt like a kind of call to action in a way, and it felt very, very intimate and very personal in a way. This exchange between the not just the speaker but the nameless women or woman who is walking alone. It reminded me of every time I walk home with my keys spikes in my hand, or the incident just last week where a man reversed his car up my street and tried to persuade me to get in and wouldn't take no for an answer. It's a nuanced poem, even though it's so short. And because it's so nuanced, it also makes me think of the guilt I feel around my own complicity in such situations. So how angry I was with myself last week when I pretended to be flattered by this person asking for my number just because I was afraid of antagonizing. And the word that you used at the beginning, antagonist, is really, really interesting. It's a really tight and meshed poem for me. The word advice is always loaded, isn't it? And I really love the way that you foreground that in the title. I think starting with that title, with the giving of advice, the kind of, it's almost like if you frame a poem as a recipe or a set of instructions, and then starting the poem itself with that imperative, think like your assailant, is really striking. And I really like the way you've isolated that on a line on its own, which kind of makes it feel all the more shocking. This line, think like your assailant. It really made me pause. And then I think from there, for me, what follows is a brilliantly arch commentary on the emphasis that we place as a society on victim blaming, the responsibility to quite literally watch your step. I kept thinking of that metaphor with walking. So the assailant is very active in this. The assailant is looking for someone, and it is the walking woman's duty to make sure that it is not her. I love how you isolate the word provocatively at the end of that first stanza to emphasize it, that little one-word line. I think we're quite used to this cultural dialogue, the notion that someone must dress to prevent attack. But here you go a bit further. I think you draw attention to the audacity of that particular word, provocatively, because of course to provoke is to incite or to cause. It's a very active word. So then in the speaker's eyes here, in the antagonist's eyes, to dress provocatively then is to bait or to invite in some way. Again, I said I was going to concentrate quite a lot on the form and how it looks. And I really love the two lines that appear as a sort of little island in the middle of the text. Don't wear headphones. There you go. You can see it beautifully there. Yeah, don't wear headphones, wear shoes you can run in. They somehow, within the world of the poem, their isolation gave me that feeling just for a second of being alone in public after dark. The lines had an almost physical effect. I felt briefly sort of marooned in the middle of the poem, in the middle of encroaching threat, and left with the silence around those lines. And it made me think of an article that I really love by a psychotherapist poet, Alan Buckley, who's published by Happenstance years ago, and he wrote an article about how every poem enacts a minor trauma somehow on the reader. It makes them unmake and then remake the world very quickly. So I was thinking about that in that middle sort of section. And then I guess when we get to the last stanza, I really loved the way that you use, I never know how to say this word, but enjambment, because by breaking after don't be afraid, you almost offer, or the speaker almost offers the reader a moment of glib reassurance, like the assurances the police might give in the wake of an incident. No need to worry, don't panic, don't be afraid. So don't be afraid there feels for a moment like a relief. But of course, it's actually just a prelude to another instruction. Don't be afraid to use your nails. And we then move quickly to the world of forensics and DNA and police analysis, implying that despite the advice from this speaker, the assault is already something of a foregone conclusion. And here is the irony that this very short but powerful poem enacts. That the walking women or woman in this poem, the women are supposed to take responsibility to prevent something that they can't prevent anyway. So it achieves a huge amount in a short space in sort of calling out these ironies that we're all familiar with from the news, from the wake of the Sarah Everard case and countless others. I'm aware that I probably talked for ages. I feel like I've talked for ages and gone on about it. But another little thing that I was interested in terms of style was the decision to have the word nails twice sort of sandwiched together, separated by a colon. It feels very stark. It felt quite claustrophobic. And I was thinking about nails scraping and the horribleness of that sound and the kind of physical violence of the image, and it also felt like having those two words separated in the middle like that with a colon felt like two opposing forces sort of pushing against each other. It created this feeling of being hemmed in, which of course made me think about the different forces at play in this poem, and indeed the idea of force. So I didn't count the number of words in the poem, but it's a spare piece. It doesn't waste its words. It's very direct and small, but it packs an incredible amount in. And I also, do you mind holding up the poem again, Lydia, so we can see how it looks on the page? Sorry, thank you. It also has this sort of sense of kind of disappearing or kind of vanishing, and again that made me think of this this feeling that you can get in the face of such advice, that you should be taking up less space, that you shouldn't be out, that you shouldn't be walking after dark, etc, etc. And so I really enjoyed the kind of fading of that, and also the way it looks a bit like a shadow. And of course there is so much shadowed in the text. There's a lot in what's not said here and in what's implied by what is said. And yeah, I found that all very interesting, very relatable to themes that I've wanted to talk about, and yeah, just very, very effective, I guess. Those were my sort of major thoughts, but I'm sure we'll pick up on themes and things about dress later as well, because as you say, how we dress is political, and always has been and always will be, I suspect, and the kind of regulation thereof and the different kinds of regulation. Yes, I'll be quiet now because I've talked for a long time.
Helen, that was fantastic. You've really done your homework. You've really looked at every letter in this poem and unpacked it. There have been some things, I mean, that I hadn't seen the shadow in it. So I love it when the feedback shows me things in a poem that I didn't know was there. The nails, I'm glad you saw the nails and the enjambment of that line, "Don't be afraid." It was one of those poems that didn't take long to write, and was written with a lot of fury, and trying to contain that, you know, rather than just sort of, you know, trying to make of the poem a tool for some kind of good, is always the challenge when you're writing about things that are especially emotive to yourself. So thank you. That was a wonderful close reading. I really appreciate it.
Oh well, it's all in the poem.
You saw it. I don't know if do you still feel this sense of astonishment when people actually get it? When you know, you've written a poem, you send it on its way out into the world, and then somebody comments, or you know, you get feedback in some form or another, and it always it's the sort of closing of the circle of communication when I for one tend to forget that is the other half of the process. You know, I just feel, oh well, I've sent it out, you know, my little boat is bobbing on the water. And then to get feedback that takes you back to the writing of the poem is always really exciting and gratifying.
And that's why this format is so lovely, I think, because you get a chance to reflect on that and to think about it. I'm obsessed with that kind of difference in. I've been thinking about it a lot with my new collection, because a lot of it is about body art and body modification. That's, oh my goodness, the professionalism of the visual cues is fantastic.
Or perhaps this one.
Oh yes, oh wow. That's tremendous, thank you.
Yeah, this is wonderful.
I think it's in one of the poems in there. It's a quote from Antonio Porcia where he says of writing, "I know what I've given you, I do not know what you have received." And it seems like that's that gap that you're talking about. That's
yes,
And I think it can apply to how we physically represent ourselves through what we wear, which kind of takes us back to dress and stuff like that as well.
Yeah.
You know what you think you are projecting, but you're not in control of other people's responses or what they might project onto you in turn.
Yes, yeah. Right, well, on that note, can you please read your poem?
Sure.
And if you want to give any background at all about how you came across this, or do you want to save that for later?
I'll give. I don't think this will, because it's not to do with the poem itself. Its context might be quite fun. This poem was written as a result of going on an amazing trip organised by In Travel and Thomas Cook, which was a walk or a journey around the Swiss Alps, to follow in the footsteps of a woman called Jemima Morell, who was from Selby in Yorkshire, and to replicate the journey that she was on, one of the very first Thomas Cook guided trips in the Alps. And they were advertising for someone to go on this trip, and it was you had to be a woman from Yorkshire who liked the outdoors and could climb, who liked writing about the outdoors.
Whose name was Helen Mort.
Who was under the age of 40 or something. So I think Jemima was in her 30s when she went on this trip. So yes, I read it and I applied, and it all came together because these were all my things. So that this poem was partly a product of walking around the Alps wearing a replica crinoline dress, but I don't think that kind of affects the poem that was written, other than that's how it happened to come about. So I was thinking about Victorian women climbing in these restrictive outfits. Shall I just read the poem and stop over explaining it, Lydia? I'll do that.
That's fine. That's just the setting we needed, I think.
So this is called Miss Jemima's Swiss Journal, and it says in the epigraph, after Jemima Morell and her tour of the Alps, 1863. Each summer I'll be Miss Jemima, snug in my temperance and crinoline, taking chocolate in Grindelwald, the Eiger flashing down stern looks. I'll be devastating in my notebooks, reserve my best scorn for the tour guide with his winter field of hair, the tittering ladies in the gardens near Reichenbach. I think I could get used to it, the chastity and limp green vegetables, as long as I could stand in my blue dress beneath the falls at Lauterbrunnen, higher than all society, a teardrop if you only saw me from the sky. Over to you, Lydia.
Thank you, Helen. And like you said, it's so wonderful hearing it read in the poet's voice. So each summer I'll be Miss Jemima, snug in my temperance and crinoline. So this is setting up someone who's playing a role. And by the time we've reached the seventh word, snug, we know this is not about coziness. We know this is about constraints. And we know that the speaker is being ironic. And, you know, within 3 short lines, we've got a little portrait of this woman. In the second stanza, we start to see the theater where this role is being played. So Miss Jemima is conforming to the expectations of, you know, genteel activities for ladies, taking chocolate, while the Eiger is flashing down stern looks. Again, so much condensed into so little space. You don't attempt to describe the landscape, which I think is wise because it's pretty indescribable. But what we do get is this verb flashing down stern looks. It gives us, we see glaciers, we see a rocky horizon, jagged outlines, and something like a touch of disapproval for the ladies, you know, indulging in something hot and sweet. The third stanza, we begin to see how Miss Jemima copes with these constraints. So she has the outlet of her writing. And here I'm reminded of, you know, the Bronte sisters or Jane Austen, you know, just letting it all out in words after spending the day either in corsets or in polite company and not perhaps being able to express things as she might like to. We also get something of the dynamic of the tour guide and the other ladies. So we have the tittering. That's full of ambiguity. I mean, are they really that silly, or are they conforming to the expectation that, you know, he's amusing and, you know, this is what you do? Whatever the answer to that is, we know that the speaker is not part of it. She's observing. And then after setting up this almost claustrophobic atmosphere, the speaker at the beginning of the 5th stanza says, I think I could get used to it. You know, if this were a sonnet, this would be the turn. That's like, whoa, didn't see that coming. But here's the deal. She'll tolerate all these constraints in return for a moment of freedom. And that moment confirms the meaninglessness of all these social norms. So standing beneath the falls at Lauterbrunnen, she is higher than all society. She's literally above these petty conventions. And the excess in the waterfalls is like an antidote to all the, you know, we've got temperance, we've got chastity, we've got the wonderful limp vegetables, which somehow go with chastity down in the valleys. And here it's just all let loose. And in the final image, she's transformed her. I see her in this dress as a kind of bell shape. And so she's transformed into a teardrop. And she says, this is how she'd appear if you only saw me from the sky. And suddenly, as the readers or the listeners, we've had the sort of extreme close-ups of the taking chocolate and the ladies in the garden. And suddenly we have this astonishing aerial view. And I don't know whether it's a sort of eagle's view or the view that they say you get before death of seeing yourself from a great height. But it's an astonishing transformation. And in becoming a teardrop, she becomes part of the waterfall. And this is just beautifully liberating. It's almost a regeneration or reincarnation. So again, what on the surface seems to be quite considered, you know, there's no excess of language in this. And yet it just packs in so much. That's my reading.
And a great reading. Thank you, Lydia. I've got exactly the same feeling that you had of you know, when somebody engages with your work and you kind of go, oh yes, that is what I'd hoped for, but I wasn't sure if it was there. Thank you.
Oh, good. So yes, the clothes we walk in. I mean, how did you find it walking in a long dress?
Unsuccessful. I mean, I found that I couldn't really get through doorways or sit in chairs very well, let alone
maneuver up.
but it has to be said that mine was a sort of replica fancy dress type version. Whether there would be more, but yeah, I think I was just thinking that even carrying the clothing must have been difficult for the whole party, because
yes,
I think I remember reading that she would have had maybe 2 dresses for this trip, and they kind of needed to alternate. but still they're very big, and they're very dense, and
Yeah.
that idea. And I found that really, really interesting. There's loads of stories of pioneering sort of female Victorian climbers in the Alps doing things like wearing trousers under their big skirts, and then they get to the foot of the climb, discard the skirt behind a rock, climb up, and then reattire themselves to go back into the town. And of course, sometimes forgetting and only realizing when they got back to civilization that the skirt was still up there on the peak, and do all that mileage all over again. I'm never sure if these stories are apocryphal or true. They almost sound too good to be true, but I can imagine.
I can believe that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just had that liberating experience of being able to wear trousers and climb properly. What I don't think I mentioned in my introduction to Helen, that she is a proper mountain climber. Sorry,
I am now. I think was past.
Well,
maybe, but not much going on there.
Well, yes, I mean, with a small child, it's a little more difficult. But yes, so she knows what she's talking about, is what I mean when she writes about climbing. Yes, it's a bit like watching early women tennis players, and just thinking, it goes back to the old Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers thing. She could do everything he could do, but backwards and in high heels. It's fairly mind-blowing.
I think of that quite a lot with the early climbers anyway, and with male climbers as well. I think about them doing things that I struggle to do now, but in hobnail boots and tweeds and stuff like that.
Yes.
Then if you bring a skirt into the equation, it's just, yeah, you can't imagine it. I mean, there was one moment on this trip. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this really, if I'm giving stuff away, but I loved the trip. I had an absolutely amazing time on it, and the people I was with were absolutely lovely. But it was a press trip because it was for an anniversary of the Thomas Cook journey. And so there's a lot of media stuff to do. And one morning, our itinerary for the day, we were in, forgive my terrible pronunciation, we're in Leukebad, and we were in the hot springs there, because it's got famous hot springs. And then we were going to go up this mountain later. And I was so itching to walk and climb and get into the mountains, because that's why I'd signed up for it. I couldn't wait. And then we all had to go in the hot springs in the morning and have photos taken in the hot springs in our swimming costumes. And I hated it. And I just felt really uncomfortable and nervous. And then they said, actually, we're going up for timings. We're going to go up the mountain in a cable car and then have photos at the top. And I had this moment of, because I'd spent all this time reading Jemima's diaries, which were beautifully poetic and really quite scathing, as you get in the poem, kind of quite sharp about people and things. And I really had this what would Jemima do moment. And I said to the woman from Thomas Cook and In Travel and the Swiss Tourist Board who was organizing it, and she was so lovely and accommodating, I just said, right, I can't do this anymore. I'm going up the mountain on my own. I'm going to walk and I'll meet you at the top, and I'm just going to go up the mountain. And, all credit to her. She was great. She didn't try and stop me. She went, oh, okay, yeah, fine. Go and get dressed. We'll see you at the top. And even sent a photographer to come down to see if he could take a picture of me climbing to the top. And that was the highlight of the trip for me, because I remember putting on my jeans and my jacket and just thinking, yes, I'm free. I don't have to have my photo taken in a swimming costume. I'm going to go up the mountain. That's what she would have liked and wanted. And it was brilliantly cold and icy. And I think the pass was technically closed. It was sort of go on at your peril kind of thing.
Yeah.
But of course it was fine. It was lovely. It was just bits of
I think it's wonderful that circumstances conspired to put you in a situation of rebellion, but
it makes you think of, because we've both said with both of our poems that they're spare. Like that was something that I said about yours and you said about mine. They're quite tightly controlled in terms of the form. And I was thinking about I don't know if it's ironic or not. I might be in danger of doing an Alanis Morissette and misuse ironic, but the idea that we're talking about the restrictions of clothing or expectations about clothing in our poems, but that form can be a kind of corset or something like that. It's a kind of it kind of I don't know, because do you find that?
You mean in a good way, a supporting?
Yeah, in a kind of
so more sort of lumbar support or something, a
exactly.
medical appliance.
Of the poem upright.
Yeah.
It's like a sort of support. And I find that difference really interesting. You know, when does a restriction become a freedom? I don't know if you find that when you're writing in.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, there's nothing more terrifying than a blank page. So if I set myself the task of writing a sonnet or, you know, a page full of haiku or something, you know, phew, got out of that one. And then something else develops out of that. But yeah, we do need some restrictions to be creative, but the difference is we opt to have them. You know, they're not dictated.
And maybe it's something to kick against almost as well, because I was really struck by what you said in your introduction about anger and controlled anger, because I very often feel like that about whatever issue it is or idea. When I sit down to write, I have to be passionate about something to want to write it, but I also know that I need some sort of net for that emotion, otherwise it'll be an unfiltered rant.
Yes,
which I'm sure I've written.
People tend to turn away from those. You know? They don't draw them in. They don't. It's not engaging. But yeah, it is very tempting to just get it all out. And sometimes that's how I start. You know, with a rant, and then pare it down and pare it down and pare it down, and then find a vehicle that, you know, will make it actually do some hopefully good work in the world.
And did you get, because you said that poem, you wrote it quite quickly, like, did you know what it was going to look like on the page before?
No, I didn't. I mean, I was when I first came to Leeds when the Ripper was active, and you know, there was all this advice, you know, that basically boiled down to stay home. You know, and it was this voice of authority that really got to me, and that's what I was trying to replicate. And on occasion, this poem has caused some incomprehension. You know, and it's so interesting that authors can write in the first person, and nobody thinks that they are being that character. But a poet writes in the first person, and everybody thinks that it's got to be autobiographical, or that you're even, you know, approving of this character that you've created. It's just one of the pitfalls.
Absolutely. I mean, like, even there's something about poetry, isn't it? Maybe it's to do with the intimacy of it, the kind of the intimacy that's created between reader and authorial voice in some way that makes us, or maybe it's to do with performance and like the personal element that often comes into biographical notes in between poems. I don't know what it is, but it's really it fascinates and confuses me, that, because it's obvious to me that in your poem that's almost like a little dramatic monologue. It's this, and
that's well put. Yeah, we
assume that I read a review of my new collection recently where the reviewer, who is also a poet, she talked about the claustrophobia of the poet's contemplation of her own body, and I was really interested by that on, well, several levels. One was that how did we know that it was my body, the poet's body, and not sometimes a dramatized body or a collective bodiliness that was. And also I was interested in it because I was like, I think that's meant as a sort of critique, because they were contrasting it with the relief of something else. And I thought, well, actually, I don't mind that in a way, because the point is to, in a sense, some of the things I was discussing in it are, the point is to sort of reflect the claustrophobia of feeling that you are trapped in a particular representation
Yes.
of yourself, which lots of people have in different ways. And so
Mhm.
I was like, oh, maybe maybe it's good that feeling was somehow
Yeah.
conveyed. But yeah, it happens
Yeah.
all the time, the conflation of narrator and poet.
Yes.
And I suppose there's loads of ethical questions that issue can connect to, and it's
Mhm.
fascinating.
Well,
But
we
yeah,
could have a whole evening on the subject of voice and who's telling whose story. I haven't had any complaints from dogs yet with my voicing of the dog in A History of Walking, but yeah. I
dogs
think
are the best subject for walking poems. I think there'd be more dogs in poems in general than walking literature.
yeah. Helen, it's been a real pleasure having you on Footloose, and I just love all the poems in this book and in the new one. In case you didn't get a good view first time, they're terrific, and I have to wrap this up. It's my last Footloose. Just say thank you to everyone who's come along faithfully and those who've just discovered it. And as I said before, all the previous episodes are on YouTube. Had some really fantastic evenings. So back to Andrew.
Well, both of you, thank you very much. That was fascinating stuff. There was a couple of questions about the Jemima's actual journals. Are they in print somewhere, or are they?
That's a good question that I would have known the answer to about 6 years ago. I would have remembered the answer. I have a feeling that they are, because I read a copy of them. I think they may have been produced as a limited edition. It's worth Googling. If you Google Jemima Morell, you'll be able to find out whether they're readable. But yeah, I also saw Emma's comment about the snow and the heaviness of the dress, which is, but then again, at that time, some of the stuff that people used to take up mountains was extraordinary as well, because bearing in mind that it would have mostly been quite a middle or upper middle class pursuit in terms of accessibility, not exclusively, but there'd be like on some women's accounts of their trips, it was like we took the food and it was a big plum cake and 2 bottles of champagne and then this, and I was thinking
It's my kind of hiking.
It's even more impressive. I think this should be reinstated personally as mountaineering fare instead of protein.
Deal, Helen. Plum cake and champagne.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know the answers to that question, and I should because I knew it at the time when I was working on it.
Anyway, well, once again, a big thank you to Lydia, and thank you so much, Helen, for being Lydia's final Footloose guest.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.